Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be discussing this book, A Shape in the Dark. The subtitle, Living and Dying with Brown Bears, written by Bjorn Dilhe. This is a man who is a lifelong resident of Southeast Alaska, living on Douglas Island. The back cover reads, A Mesmerizing Portrait of Brown Bears. The full price would be $18 US. It's got the genres Natural History, Alaska, and Memoir. There's a tag here that says $13, which is what I paid for it. I don't know exactly where I bought it, but it's marked in the same way Coas books would be marked, but it also has a price tag on it that looks nothing at all like Coas books. I'm willing to bet maybe someplace in Albuquerque or Tucson. Tucson would be a better guess. This book is copyright 2021. The copy editor Ali Shah. The back cover photo is from the author himself. The cover design and book design by Jen Grable. There's a note here, printed on 100% recycled and FSC certified materials. Portions of some chapters were previously published in a different form in Alaska Magazine, Sierra Magazine, and Juneau Empire. This book is similar in style to The 9 Mile Wolves, or what was the name of it? It's much more similar to True Grizz, both in content and in the scope of what they're discussing. In True Grizz, it's focused heavily on northern Montana grizzly bears. This book focuses heavily on bears from the southeastern part of Alaska. The prologue reads, In August of 2004, I borrowed my friend Forrest Wagner's ancient pickup truck in Fairbanks and headed north. I had a couple weeks before my classes would begin at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I hoped to climb Mount Doonarak in the central Brooks Range. As I drove through graveyards of charred, spindly black spruce rising from the smoke from forest fires, the Alaska pipeline appeared every so often in the gray. The silhouette of the Brooks Range shone hazy in the smoke. I hid Forrest's truck in a willow thicket 10 miles south of the Continental Divide, shouldered my backpack, and began hiking up an ember-tinted valley. The muddy creek banks were lined with grizzly tracks and caribou bones. I traveled into the mountains past herds of dull sheep that watched me warily. At my second camp, I woke to a gray wolf howling from a nearby knoll. 2 dark wolves, the wild amber of their eyes electrifying the soft glow of the early morning, walked by within yards of my tent. It's a good basis for how this author writes. It is mostly first-person perspective. And throughout that story, he ends up meeting a couple tourists. Let's see, an older man who doesn't want to go back to Japan. His family wants him to go to school, get married, and work. I never go back to Japan, I just go. At the university, he fumbled through the motions, and instead of renting a cabin or a room, he pitched his tent in the woods a few miles from campus. He thought of a bear he had encountered in those mountains in the prologue and thought of how close it had come to maiming, maybe even killing Bjorn. I thought of how the threat of death made me realize how deeply in love with life I was. I woke at the smallest changes in the forest and wondered if the bear had traveled 300 miles south to find me. So it goes on to describe his work as well as some contextual history of bears in the area that he lives. So the first part is that context, that history, with chapters titled The Skin of the Bear, The Man Who Killed Bears, Doonarak, Alaska Bear Wars, Wilderness Lost, and then there's an interlude. This interlude is really interesting, in my opinion, because it mentions Doug Peacock, who is a known associate of Rick Bass and of Terry Tempest Williams. And in The Lost Grizzlies, which is another book I read and discussed on this channel, one written by Rick Bass, as they search for any sign of grizzly bears in southern Colorado, only about 15 years after the last confirmed sign of grizzly in the mountains near Silverton and Durango, the San Juan Wilderness, I want to say. So that's one of those stories that Doug Peacock has shown up in and was very intimately involved with. Doug Peacock is one of those that ran with Edward Abbey in those same circles, and I want to say there's a whole network of authors that I've discussed on this channel that have interacted with that web of people. This isn't a discussion of the author having met Doug Peacock, but more a moment where he discusses Doug Peacock's own life and how that intersects with the subject of this book. So he was a Green Beret medic who had just finished serving 2 tours in the highlands of Vietnam, flew home to Michigan. He would later become a cult hero and an author who would write the book Grizzly Years in Search of the American Wilderness. In that book, he recounts how during the war he had carried a map of Montana and Wyoming. He was surrounded by madness, violence, and death, but he'd study the blank places on the worn paper and imagine mountains, rivers, and woods. Then it says he drove north to Yellowstone. An attack of malaria came on as he made camp. Soon after, he was lying in his tent with a dangerous fever, racked by chills. After a few days of delirium, the fever broke and he was able to crawl out of his tent. The following morning, while he was soaking in a warm spring, a mother grizzly and 2 cubs appeared. When the bears ambled closer, Peacock rose naked from the creek and sprinted for a tree, colliding with the trunk so hard that he gashed his forehead and nearly knocked himself unconscious. He clawed his way up and sat on a branch. The bears ignored him as they ate grass and dug roots. Eventually, the family wandered off and he made his way back to camp, exhausted and on the verge of hypothermia. Now that I knew real grizzlies lurked in the shadows, my dreams were not so important, Peacock wrote. Something big was out there. For the first time since returning to the world, my thoughts chose themselves without Vietnam intruding. And it continues how Peacock allegedly chooses not to shoot a bear. The bear was considering attacking Peacock, and he pulls out his firearm and chooses to not shoot the bear. And the author, Bjorn Deal, writes, at the time, Peacock likely didn't understand the significance of his not shooting that bear. He just knew he found it easier to talk to bears than to priests. In the narrative of America's relationship with brown bears, that moment represents a paradigm shift, a new perspective for future generations to consider. Grizzlies and the wilderness saved the veteran's life, and in return he would spend the rest of his life, a half century and counting, learning from them and advocating on their behalf. Peacock acts as a path of hope for the future of people, bears, and wild places. So that's a degree of influence. That web of people, Terry Tempest Williams, Rick Bass, Edward Abbey, Doug Peacock, these people affect so many other authors, including, Gary Paul Nabin, Dexter K. Oliver, and other authors as well. So that's another time I've seen that web of personalities interact with the books I'm reading, and I really love finding those moments. This book is published 2021, and for the most part, it looks like the events of this story in part 2 the events of his interactions with bears are mostly within the decade before this book published, so 2010 up through 2020. So yeah, there's a lot to see in this book. It mostly focuses on explorations of that region of Alaska in the 2000s, and that's kind of a newer age, a newer generation of outdoor enthusiasts turning to magazines and articles and books to express themselves. This is a really fun book, and the insight it has into bears is incredible. He talks a lot about named bears. He even mentions a book in the openings to the chapters. He has quotes from various books or poets or authors about bears. And what I found really interesting is chapter 15 has a quote from The Sacred Paw, which is another book on my shelves. So again, there's all these different authors that I've read that are like building on top of other authors. This one builds on top of The Sacred Paw, on top of Doug Peacock's work. The Sacred Paw builds on top of previous works. All these different authors are creating a pretty good web of interaction, and that's one of the things I really love about this book, is finding those moments. There's a good moment near the end of the book that I really, really enjoy, and I think is one of the better ways to give you an idea of what to expect in this book, in his writing. In the spring of 2019 at Pack Creek, I sat watching Mocha as she and her two cubs approached. I was happy to see the cubs as they wrestled and chased ravens, but I knew the odds they were facing. At 24 years old, Mocha had only had one cub make it to adulthood. Cub mortality rate during the first year is high, mostly due to predation from adult male bears. One study put Admiralty Islands at 60%. Some people theorize that female bears who are more habituated to people are worse mothers. Mocha's behavior was different that spring. She kept her cubs close and possessed an anxiety I'd never seen in all the years I'd known her. I thought how against all odds, the lack of food the previous year, another season of poor salmon runs, dangerous bears, people who want to kill her kind, and threatening new weather patterns, she had brought these cubs into the world. And in a way, they were connected to my son. That's the writing in this book. He has a very personal connection to a lot of these bears because he lives and works around those bears. And I think if you choose to read this book, you're going to have a good experience. It is really fun to read through. It's a page turner, but it's also insightful and wholesome and heartwarming and intellectual and educational, and so many other adjectives. This is a really, really good book, and I'm glad I picked it up. I read it twice, and it's one of those books, if you see on the shelf, you should buy it. Anyway, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.